Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Eyet. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action. Megan, thanks so much for joining us. And this summer, we're doing a series called Summer Reads, where we bring in interesting authors to talk about their works. And quite frankly, I don't necessarily think about presidents and their money and think honest and hard-earned, but, that's okay. You're here to probably dispel my myth and my conspiracy theories and tell us some good old American bootstrapping stories, right? Is that it?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, right? And look, I hear you. We live in a day and age today where people are so cynical. But it's so funny. People ask me all the time, like, why are you so into the presidents? And I have to tell you, I'm from a very small town in New Jersey. It's called Cape May. And when I was growing up almost 50 years ago, which I can't believe was almost 50 years ago, we were so cut off from the rest of the world. And the first time I started to read about the presidents when I was 6 or 7 years old, I was sort of transformed by the fact that their stories typically followed a certain path, right? You typically had a poor boy in a small town who finds his way to make his way out in the world and succeeds beyond his wildest expectations. And so, after all these years of doing wealth management and tax work, I wanted to dive back in and see, what was sort of the true story behind all the myths we hear about the presidents. And I have to tell you, it'll make you a little less cynical about a lot of them.
Well, that in and of itself is gives me a want to listen more. But let's talk about I teach at Berkeley, and one of the things I always start off with my students is I start off by telling them about my first business venture that failed. And it was doing laundry for other college students. And the irony of it was at that time, this was right around kind of during the dot-com bubble, is that you may not remember this, but there was a time when people were skeptical about putting their credit cards on the internet. Mm-hmm. And that was actually what killed my business, was that the parents couldn't pay me for their kids' laundry.
You were before Zelle and Venmo. You were just a little bit too early.
A little too early. But I know that there are other presidents who made mistakes, and I shouldn't say made mistakes, tried things and failed. Kind of opened the book famously with the story of FDR. What's that?
Okay, well, first of all, you doing laundry for people when you're in college, that's very Herbert Hoover. So before I get into failures,
please tell me more.
Before we get into FDR, let's talk about Hoover real quick. Herbert Hoover grows up poor, and he ends up getting into the pioneer class over at Stanford. And you're not going to believe this, Jeff, but the first year, the tuition at Stanford when it first opened was $0. But the room and board was through the roof. And so what Herbert Hoover did was he did laundry for others. And so he was before the day and age of credit cards. So his business did succeed. But when you look at the presidents who maybe faltered or failed, there's a number of big names that you would be surprised about. FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Richard Nixon. And, I think their failures at times helped them. In terms of opening the book, I talk about an investment that FDR did. Now, FDR came from a wealthy family. He was both a Roosevelt and he was a Delano. And the Delano family had more money. They made a lot of their money in the opium trade. Well, actually, they made a lot of money, lost a lot of money, and made a lot of money again. And so he comes from a very different perspective than most presidents. But we can relate a lot to him because he's a lot like a wealthy tech person in Silicon Valley, because FDR liked to angel invest. And it's weird for us to hear this, but if in his time period at the turn of the century, things that they were focused on was really food focused. People wanted food in certain regions of the country to be on the table of everybody in America. And FDR heard about this business, about getting lobstermen in Maine to harvest the lobsters and then ship them all around the country so that you could have lobster even if you were in Kansas or Nebraska or even Maine lobster in California. And it sounds like a great idea. And he goes and invests in it. And like a lot of these investments we see today, it goes sideways. It's almost like he did a bit of a convertible note in our parlance today. And what's really interesting about this is when you go through the documents of when all of this is occurring, is he makes the investment in early 1921. And obviously, this is right after he loses the vice presidency. And it is months before he gets stricken with polio. And he gets stricken with polio in August of 1921. And so he makes this investment before he gets sick. And the investment just starts to bleed cash. And he does that thing that we all do, which is he throws more money at it, right? Just to keep it going, right? And of course, what you see when you actually look at the historical documentation is all the correspondence is not from FDR. Because as we know, FDR is at Campobello, struggling, comes back to New York, he's getting treatments, he's trying to survive. But the correspondence is with his political manager, Louis Howe. And Louis Howe is probably the person who helped make Franklin Roosevelt politically. And Louis Howe is negotiating with these lobster fishermen trying to save this investment. And of course, ultimately it fails and FDR, refuses to add any more money into it. He loses, and probably our money, about $450,000. So just a drop in the bucket for him. But for the regular American, it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
But again, I think what you learn about FDR is that FDR is unafraid to take chances on wild and crazy ideas, right? And you think about what he goes on to do in his lifetime, not just, World War II and the Lend-Lease program and the Depression, but in his pursuit to cure polio and the pursuit of a vaccine. He took on some pretty crazy ideas then as well. So I always feel when people fail at business, it's really a great learning experience. And so our buddy FDR, he was not perfect with money in any way, shape, or form, but he was able to parlay his failures into experiences that helped him down the line.
And that's sometimes some people say they're the most expensive lessons we learn, but also if your lesson only costs money, some people say they're the cheapest lessons that we learn. But either way, those lessons are kind of bringing about these issues with money. And I think because these people are presidents, it's easy for us to say, well, it didn't hurt them as much. Or, they wouldn't have done it if they didn't think they could win, right? Because of their status. But in reality, they're just people. So what are some of the similarities that you saw between the president's challenge with money and just the regular person's challenge with money?
Yeah, I think most presidents, and even ones that were wealthy, struggle with it as well, is Americans all want to achieve the American dream, right? Mm-hmm. But there is the need for financial literacy. And what you see over the course of American history is while we look back in retrospect and see how successful they are, and presidents today monetize when they leave the White House, in the moment, they're often not successful. Right. And so when you look at the ones who failed, Harry Truman famously failed. Now, his haberdashery shop was like one of the 5th businesses he owned that failed. And it was more by external forces like inflation that did him in. But those failures help. And I think we can't lose sight of that. Now, one of the things I will point out to you is I actually think failures can often propel you into wealth. So I talked about in the beginning, we always love the story of the poor boy who goes off on his way and makes his way in the world.
Sure.
Well, the first six presidents were wealthy, right? Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Quincy Adams, all came from money. All were the landed class. But president number 7 was Andrew Jackson. And I think Andrew Jackson sort of makes people excited because he is so American. Father dies before he's born. He's born pre-Revolutionary War. During the war, he's taken prisoner. His mother and his brothers die during the war. And he's sort of this orphaned boy. And he makes his way out into the wild west of the United States, becomes an attorney. But like a lot of people, he wanted to make money. And so he had a little finger in every pot. And he really wanted to get into land speculation. Now, you probably know this from being in wealth management, today clients will say to me, why do I pay for title insurance, Megan? That seems like a lot of money for not a lot of stuff. But in the United States, in the 1790s and the early 1800s, it was hard to prove title, right? Was land acquired appropriately from Native Americans? Who really owned these pieces of land? And, Jackson would be paid in these certificates as a lawyer to own land. So Jackson got into buying large swaths of land with the idea of flipping it, right? We all do this today, right?
Sure.
And so he gathers all this land, buys it on the cheap, but he's not the only one doing it. And what happens is there ends up being too much supply and not enough demand for the land. And so Jackson at the same time was trying to open a store in Tennessee. And so he goes to Philadelphia. He wants to buy stuff for the store. And he's got all this land and he's sort of cash poor, right? We know this feeling. This is a very universal feeling. And come on, if you're starting a business, you know what it's like to be cash poor. And Jackson is so overwhelmed because he needs to be able to buy things for the store to sell to the customer. And he meets a gentleman in town who offers to buy the land. And Jackson is sort of like, okay, I think so. And he agrees to do it for certificates of land or certificate of gold that the guy gives him. And Jackson takes the certificates, orders the merchandise for the store, goes back to Tennessee, and then he starts getting letters. And those letters are like, look, that guy you think you sold the land to, his money isn't good. You basically just gave away that land. You have no money. And now you've got this bill with bringing all this merchandise down to Tennessee. And Jackson's apoplectic, right? And he finally sells a bunch of stuff to pay off the bills in Philadelphia for all the stuff for the store, sells the store, and is out of it. And I bring this up because his first sort of getting out there into the world to make money fails spectacularly. But he learns really valuable lessons. Jackson's very cynical, right? He's very American. He's very passionate, but he becomes sort of jaded about the whole thing. And he learns how to be really savvy with land, which, 30 years later, after the War of 1812, in that time period, he ends up taking advantage of what he learns to acquire land.
Sure. In the 1820s, 1830s, he buys up the Southeast United States and uses the military to further those ends.
Whether that was the right thing to do, that's, for other historians to have the debate, but it's about building wealth. So what I would tell you is when I find these stories of the presidents failing, I really want to think about if I'm them and what am I learning from this moment? And Jackson, unlike Jefferson, unlike Madison on Monroe or Quincy Adams, he couldn't fail because he had no backstop. And that's so powerful. I think this is why he captures our imagination, even though there's a lot of things about him that's incredibly controversial. And if you want to see the accumulation of his wealth, I suggest going to see the Hermitage, which is a stunning plantation. And of course, obviously Jackson was a slaveholder, which is controversial as well. But failure is not a bad thing.
I agree. And it's interesting. You've really told us two stories that contrast well is FDR as sort of the angel investor. And he did something very simple because actually in New England, before the railroads and before transportation, lobster was actually served to prisoners because it was so abundant and it was so cheap. And he took something that literally had no value in one market and used the transportation network to move it to another market that didn't even understand the taste, but just hoped to play on scarcity. And then you have on the flip side, you have Jackson, who, like you said, was so poor that he couldn't fail. And, interestingly enough, used probably less scrupulous means than FDR to achieve his end. But nonetheless, he achieved that end. So is it fair to say that you can draw these compare and contrast between presidents to come up with some sort of sense of not just wealth from a presidential perspective, but that we can even use as we're building our own portfolios or developing our own strategies?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. When I was writing the book, one of the challenges I had is when you start to write about the presidents, it becomes a book report, right? And you're like, oh God, this is going to be really boring. And I don't want to be boring. And so then I thought about how do I frame the book? And one of the things I came up with was I work with high net worth individuals. I know you've done that over the course of your career, and you see certain traits in them, right? It's not about knowing to buy this stock over another stock. It's about understanding who you are, understanding what traits you have, what your strengths are, and playing off of them. And so I think with presidents like Jackson, you see it again with Lincoln, these are guys who had no backstop. They had to sink or swim. And so you see them survive in a very unique way and basically grab the American dream and blow through the roof on it, right? Abraham Lincoln died with $85,000 or the equivalent of $2 million in today's dollars. Unbelievable stories. But, again, traits are really, really, it's all about life experience. And then some of it's a little bit about what happens to you. And I want to talk a little about George Washington. Washington, when I was doing my research, became a favorite, not because he's the first president, but what you realize is, he's a really fascinating, interesting, clever guy. And what Washington was able to do is be very, very strategic. Now, we all know he grew up in Mount Vernon, but what we often don't realize is he was the child of a second marriage, and his father had a son from the first marriage. And when his father dies, when George is like 13 years old, his dad makes no accommodation for George in the estate plan, including paying for George to go to college.
Wow.
So George has to figure it out. But George is good with connections. And in the high net worth world, who you know sometimes matters more than what you know. And he was friends with his neighbors, the Fairfaxes. We know them today as the Fairfaxes of Virginia. And he was very good. Once the Fairfaxes took him under their wing, George had a knack for budgeting. And George Washington's budgets are all throughout, the Library of Congress. Mount Vernon has some, and they're beautiful. And George Washington budgeted constantly. And it's so funny because why this is so important with George Washington is he uses his budgeting to problem solve. So when you look at his correspondence throughout the Revolutionary War, yes, he's concerned about what's going on in the war. He's also managing a massive plantation. Because once he learned how to survey through the Fairfaxes, he started to buy up a ton of land. And then he did something very strategic. He married up. He married a wealthier woman. He was one of the wealthiest men in the United States, but he was constantly managing his businesses, writing his overseers. I've read letters of his where he's selling off small tracts of land and people are trying to pay him in these land certificates. And he's like, no, I want cash. George was very savvy in running his businesses. And when you had that type of plantation, you were like a CEO. And so I think what the takeaway from George Washington is, business-wise, is figure out how do you maximize data that you can make decisions. For him, it's these pristine budgeting exercises. And by the way, he was not paid to be the commander of the Revolutionary Army. He told them he would take no salary because he strategically knew it was better to be honorable. But he told Congress they had to pay his expenses. Congress had no idea it would take 8 years to finish the war. George Washington's expenses were $160,000 in that time period. They went through and they audited the books and they were perfect. The numbers tied up. But you see on key dates, George Washington's buying corn for people, on July 4th, 1776. So big days in American history, and George is still budgeting. But again, data is important, and how you absorb data and how you're willing to decide what is the priority. And I say this because other people of that time period, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, were often unwilling to do the hard work of selling a little piece of land to create liquidity to keep the business going. George Washington was incredibly savvy.
And that's an interesting point that you bring up. And one thing that struck me about the George Washington story was his use of asymmetric data. We talk about that even today in the realm of AI, is that the value is not in the model. The value is often in that proprietary data that can help you use the model to your advantage. And George Washington did the same thing, almost 250 years ago. We're taking asymmetric data, his nuanced budgets, putting that into a system, the U.S. government, and understanding that he could extract greater value by paying his expenses and then leverage that to his advantage in the end. And that's the one thing I think that really sticks out to me from a business strategy perspective that you talked about.
Yeah. And look, one of the things that George Washington focused on, I should also tell you, is succession planning. Right. George Washington in that time period was often asked to be executor of people's estates. When George Washington died, his estate was open for 50 years. There's actually a book of everything that happens from when he dies until the estate finally closes 50 years later. So he thinks about all the things that we do today in terms of running business, right? He thought about where is all these different things going to play out and how do I want this to happen? And that sounds obvious, but when you look at the estates of Thomas Jefferson, his estate was a disaster. Jefferson died and Monticello had to be sold at auction. So not everyone does the work that they need to do.
At the Berkeley Innovation Group, we are a strategy consultancy and AI advisory firm focused on mid-market companies looking to unlock big growth. In contrast to management consultants' typical top-down, hypothesis-driven approach, Big uses a curiosity-inspired, bottom-up approach, leveraging customer insights to drive strategy co-creation. Learn more about our approach by downloading our ebook at biginnovates.com/ebook. Now, back to the show.
Well, Megan, this has been awesome so far. I mean, we always think of presidents and we love, as Americans, we love the classic rags to riches story that you talked about, from, Harding doing laundry to Jackson, being in land speculation. But what really struck me was kind of George Washington and his vision for the future. And I think one of the challenges we face in America today is we're an extraction economy. We're trying to take tomorrow and monetize it today. And what he really understood was what I see today in more Eastern cultures, where it's how are we planning for a dynasty or a legacy? And we're just stewards of something today that will carry on past us. And as executives, it's easy to want to hit our quarterly numbers. And I understand the market requires that. But your family-owned businesses are often as or more successful from a financial perspective because they can take that more stewardship-like approach. So maybe go back to the beginning. And I know we just touched on Jefferson. What are some presidents who made mistakes, focused on the short term at the expense of the long term? And who are some presidents who maybe sacrificed in the short term for the benefit of the long term?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's part of building wealth. Some of it is macro forces, right? And so you have to remember these people like Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Monroe were subject to their crops, the weather, right? All of those things. But Jefferson was an interesting case because Jefferson is basically focused on being an honorable person. And one of the things that he does early on is he takes on the debts of his father-in-law. And, this is right before the full Revolutionary War is kicking in. And as Jefferson is trying to pay off the debts, the currency is being devalued. The British wouldn't take the money, so he's being challenged in this way. So Jefferson gets to this position where he's always borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. And he's always pushing off into the future. And what's interesting is his two buddies, James Madison and James Monroe, and the three of them were all close friends, all sort of run their money very similarly. Like, I'll give you an example with James Monroe, did a number of diplomatic missions and didn't submit some of his expenses for decades, and then expected Congress to pay him, 40 years after the fact. So again, not a lot of thinking ahead. But there's one president that I walked away from my research. It changed my impression of him, right? And that is Warren G. Harding, right? So you've got Washington, the great strategist, and you got Warren G. Harding, who, if most people, you ask what they know about him, they'll say, Teapot Dome, died in San Francisco at the Palace Hotel. And if you watch, John Oliver, he had an affair with and had a mistress in the White House. So you don't really know a lot about this guy, but where Harding is fascinating is he's like a lot of our Silicon Valley guys today. He, grew up in Ohio and he wanted to have a business. He tried to be a teacher. He tried to sell insurance. None of it fit. But he and his buddies got together and there was a fledgling paper called the Marion Star for sale for $300. And what's really interesting about the newspaper that is there is newspapers, unlike today, are going through a revolution. It is a huge, huge opportunity. So he buys into the paper. One of his friends bails. He buys that friend out. The other friend doesn't want to take a lead seat. And so Harding takes over. And Harding really gets into having a newspaper, growing it. He gets into, and this sounds weird, he has this idea that ads in the newspaper should be seasonal. So you should advertise for snow shovels in winter and
Novel
for rakes
concept.
in summer. Obvious. Wasn't done at the time period. He also does something and he marries a woman who's very good with money, right? Who you marry matters.
Yes.
But what happens with Harding is he grows this newspaper and he has this idea that other companies are starting to get into, which is employees should have an ownership stake. And so he sets it up like an ESOP. Now, the Marion Star becomes the thing that propels him into politics. It's a nationally known newspaper. And what's fascinating about Harding is he was always thinking ahead. And when he was in the White House, he started to realize, what am I going to do when I finish the presidency?
Wow.
I can't go back to running a paper. I do want to have like a op-ed column, but what am I going to do with this newspaper? It has so much value and I have all these employees. And he decides to sell it. And as he does this journey of understanding, which, he goes across America up to Alaska and makes his way down to California, Harding is working on selling the newspaper and redoing his estate plan, which the two do go together, right? And so he, is about to close on the newspaper. He was going to make the equivalent in today's money of about $8 or $9 million. But it
Wow.
wouldn't be just him making that, because his employees would also benefit. But the other thing he does, and he also worked it out in the agreement that he would have that op-ed column, but he also goes and he updates his estate plan because he doesn't have children. And he says, look, if I die, my wife gets access to the assets. He does a Q-tip in today's parlance. But if she dies, reversion back to my family line. And so he gets all of this done. The paper doesn't close until after he dies. And of course, he ends up at the Palace Hotel of August of 1923 and dies of a heart attack. And of course, his wife dies within the following year. And so there's no one there in a Jackie Kennedy-esque legacy type protection program. And so, of course, Harding is lambasted by everybody. But he was really good to his employees. They used to call him WG. He really felt the employees were key to his success. He did a lot of things. You would find in his correspondence, if somebody lost their spouse, he would help widows who had worked for him or that had worked, and send money and do the right things by these people. So he was actually a very warm character and cared deeply about the people who worked with him and helped make the newspaper a success. And I think that says a lot about leadership. The fact that he was never just going to sell this business and it was going to be just for him. He wanted people to feel that they were part of the bigger picture. And I think we see that today a lot more. I mean, founders talk about this, and Harding was a good founder.
I'm familiar with the story of him keeping his mistress, and while he was in the White House, and a small town girl from Ohio that got swept up in the starlight of a president. But again, this is something that happens today, is that there's skeletons in the closet that can throw a monkey wrench not only into someone's public persona, but also into their financial lives. What do you see in terms of, just more broadly speaking, people who have, let's put it this way, they have real life commitments that they can't keep after their passing? And are there presidents that whose estates found themselves in a delicate position? And if so, what can we learn from that today?
Yeah, I mean, Abraham Lincoln died intestate. Seems shocking, right? The man had visions of his own death, right? And he was an attorney, but the shoemaker's children always have the worst shoes. And of course, he also had a wife who, whether, depending on how people like to diagnose historically, she had a lot of challenges with spending. And so when Lincoln dies, they look for a will and they can't find one. So Robert Todd Lincoln calls in the Chief Justice of the United States to administer the estate. And it's a complex estate because Lincoln had acquired a lot of assets over the course of his life. Lincoln had learned that one of the best ways to make money was to lend it. So he was lending a lot of money to people and clipping the income. Yeah. He had rented out the house in Springfield. And during the war, he put his money where his mouth was, because as he received some of his $25,000 a year salary, anything he didn't spend, he bought treasury notes and bonds that were yielding 6 or 7% in support of the Union cause. And so the Chief Justice comes in and gathers the assets, picks up the accrued income that's out there, finishes the rent, and it's about $85,000. But without an estate plan, what they did is they followed basically the basic rules, which is Mary Todd Lincoln gets a third, Robert Todd Lincoln gets a third, and Tad Lincoln gets a third. And basically that's what happens. And at this time period, there were no pensions. There had been one exception made for a pension for the widow of William Henry Harrison, 50 years before. But there was no presidential pension. There wasn't anything for the surviving first lady. And you have to remember, if your president dies or is killed during his presidency, he's paid through the end of that day. So Lincoln was paid through the day he was assassinated, which was actually the next morning. JFK was paid through the day he died, Garfield and McKinley. So, Mary Todd Lincoln ends up struggling for the rest of her life. And at one point, they do give her some money from Congress because she's just a hot mess, making everybody crazy. But Lincoln, it feels like such a miss from somebody who went from nothing, made a number of financial mistakes, and then made it. The fact that he didn't have an estate plan. And I can't mention this enough in business because it's so important to think about what happens once you're gone. What he probably should have done and would have done if he thought had the time to write it was put the assets in trust for Mary Todd, have someone else administer it, and keep her under control. Instead, She ran across America and Europe for the rest of her life, really deeply troubled. And of course, she had her husband murdered in front of her. That's not something you can
Right.
easily bounce back from.
Yeah. And I think we can plan for what we know, but then even planning for the edges of what we know, or perhaps even worse, the unknown, that's where the real challenges arise. And so, sure, is there a chance that your partner could pass? Yes. But to pass in traumatic fashion and to think of the mental anguish and emotional anguish that brings on someone and how that may change how they behave justifiably, that's not planned for. It's not really, you're not thinking like a steward. At least that's my perception and something I like to think about.
Yeah. And one of the presidents today, if you go in, Secretary Clinton, we had her documents pretty public through 2016. And the Clintons had set up an irrevocable life insurance trust back in the early 2000s. And that was some of their planning that they had done. And of course, the unified credit back in the early 2000s was, $675,000, the amount you could pass free of estate tax at your death. So what you see with some of the more modern presidents is the use of trusts. You see them passing houses down, right? You see a lot more charitable planning because even though they all set up their own libraries, the libraries often have a charitable arm, Carter Center, the Nixon Foundation, right? The different pieces. So today's presidents are far more organized. And I want to make sure I bring this president up because I'd be remiss, because if you asked me who does it the best or who transformed it all, I say Jerry Ford is one of the most interesting presidents we've ever had with money.
Well, this is enough here because I think most people couldn't point to many accomplishments in the presidency of Gerald Ford, but clearly you're going to educate us. So I'm ready.
Yeah.
Let's
And look,
go.
Jerry Ford is an interesting guy, right? I mean, he grew up and, his mother divorced his father when he was an infant. He didn't grow up with a lot of money. He played football. He got some scholarship money to go to college. He was donating blood while he was a student and working also in the dining hall. But Jerry Ford was a politician for most of his career. He was a congressman from Michigan. And of course, he stumbles into the presidency. And what's fascinating is when he becomes president, he and Betty had a deal that if he didn't become Speaker of the House, he was going to retire and go make money. So when he becomes president, they still stay in their split level, in Virginia while the Nixons are moving out. And when they finally move into the White House, Ford has to ask, when is payday? Because he's got a mortgage. Ford had a couple $100,000. They did not have a lot of money. And so what Ford did that was very clever is, when he got to the end of his presidency, he was really upset about it, right? Because most of them will tell you it takes 2 years to get a hang of it. And he was just getting the hang of it. And it got ripped away from him. But when he was president during the bicentennial. And he had gotten to know a lot of Hollywood people. And he got to know this guy named Norm Brokaw. Norm Brokaw doesn't mean that much to us today. But at the time period, he had been Marilyn Monroe's agent. He was,
Oh, wow.
every Mark Spitz's agent. He was the agent for everybody. And they'd gotten to know each other. And so when he loses the presidency, Ford invites Brokaw over at the suggestion of a speechwriter. And Ford's like, look, I'm young. I'm like 61. I don't want to play golf all day. I need a strategy. And so he works with Brokaw and they come up with sort of a 3-part strategy. They were going to write a book, pretty obvious, right? But they broke new ground because it was the first joint book deal because Betty got a book too. He was going to do speaking engagements. And then he wanted to do something called entrepreneurial endeavors. And I talk about this in the book because what I talk about in the book is Jerry Ford does one endeavor that goes sideways. And that is back in the day, Franklin Mint was taken very, very seriously. Today we think of it as a kitschy company, but
Right.
it was a publicly traded stock. It did really well.
Wow.
In 1976, they did phenomenally well because everybody was buying all this gold stuff and metals. So Jerry Ford agrees with Franklin Mint to put out a series of medals called, Visions of the Presidency. And of course, they advertise it in magazines and you can buy the whole thing. And basically it hits the public and people are like, oh, this is trashy. Like, who does Jerry Ford think he is? He was an accidental president. And they really did not react. The public did not react to this very well. Now today, right, we got Trump wine and,
Right.
all this other stuff. But back 50 years ago, this was like, people clutched their pearls. And so Ford learned a very important thing, that he could do some things post-presidency, but not others, because it would offend the moral values of Americans. And so what Ford ends up pivoting to was going on the board of publicly traded companies. And Sandy Weill said this in his oral testimony at the Nixon Library. He said, what Jerry Ford brought to us, no other board member could do. He saw the world at such a different level, and he could give us perspectives. So Jerry Ford at one point was on, I think, 8 or 9 boards.
Wow.
And he would often get his own special deal, because usually board members everybody gets the same. He had his own special arrangement. He would get stock, right? And he would work these boards, and he was incredibly successful. And he transformed what it meant to make money post-presidency. And we believe, it's not public because everything was in a trust when he and Betty passed, but his estate was probably close to $8 or $9 million upon his passing. And so Jerry Ford managed very well, was very strategic, and was unafraid to pivot when the moment was right, when it was not working out for him.
That's fascinating. And someone who, like you said, when they started their presidency, were asking when is payday, to someone who really leveraged, I think a cynic might say, leverage the connections that he made as as president. But again, that was his job. He was paid, and we wouldn't fault anyone else for leveraging the connections they make during their professional endeavors. So be it.
And by the way, when you go in the oral histories of the Ford Library, Susan Ford Bales, his daughter, talks about the fact that her father hated debt. And he would be on all of the Ford kids. How's your mortgage? Did you pay it off yet? And she would try to explain to him mortgage deductions and leverage. He never wanted to hear about it. He wanted you to be debt free. And
Wow.
I think that that's an important element, that someone who could go be on boards post-presidency wanted that safety and stability of owning that house in Rancho Mirage and in Vail.
Yeah. Well, as we get to near the end of the episode, why don't you just kind of bring us to the present day? And again, not making political statements, but just from an objective perspective, what did the last, we've been in this Biden-Trump dynamic for, 10 years now. And
it's exhausting.
So, yeah, I know. I hesitate to say, but it's true. It's been 10 years that we've been in this ping pong match. Like, what do we learn about each? Take away the politics, but underneath, what is something that each man did or didn't do well in terms of how they managed their wealth and what we could learn?
Yeah, when I think of Joe Biden, I often think of James Madison.
Okay.
James Madison, as you know, married Dolly Payne, who became Dolly Madison. But Dolly Madison was married previously. And when she was living in Philadelphia with her husband and her 2 children, there was a yellow fever outbreak. She loses everyone except her 2-year-old son, Payne Todd. And so when she marries James Madison, they know this child's been through so much trauma. They're very overindulgent with him. And overindulgent in such that whenever he started to get into trouble, they just bailed him out. And so they give him great opportunities to, work in the diplomacy and so on. And Payne Todd squanders everything. He gambles. He becomes an alcoholic, just runs up huge debts and basically causes financial ruin for his parents. And so why I say that is, I think when you look at Biden and you look at Madison, I think you see people with really good intentions with their money in helping their kids, particularly after a trauma, right? We know in the Biden story, his first wife is killed in the car accident with the baby daughter. And I think sometimes what James Madison and Joe Biden really should have thought about with their money was, how do you create appropriate boundaries to give your kids the right opportunities, but not overindulge them? And I think that's been part of Biden's struggle, is the pain that happened to him, like what they saw with the Madisons. I think it's just hard to manage money. I think when you go to the Trumps, right, there's sort of 2 things that always come to mind. One, there is this need to always be focused on estate planning and taxes. If you and I had the tax return in front of us, we would probably see, FLPs, grats, we'd see all the different bells and whistles of movement of money. So with the Trumps, you always have to focus on the fact that they are very focused on generational wealth movement. But Trump himself is like all of us. He repeats patterns. And if you're successful with money in a certain way, you go to repeat it again and again and again. And I'm sitting here today in Cape May, New Jersey. Up the road from me is Atlantic City. I grew up during the Trump and Atlantic City years. And what you learn is his behavior is to come in, be over the top bombastic, almost like a showman, and, really not be focused on growing a business, but on getting what you can out of the business. So when you look at how Trump made his money in Atlantic City, it wasn't really from the casinos, but he was getting salaries and bonuses. And then there would be a lot of frivolous lawsuits and so on. And he was often paid from those things to step away. And so again, I say that's more repeatable financial behaviors. So I tell people, think about what your behavior is that makes you successful, but be aware of where it can create vulnerabilities for you in your finances.
I think that's so true. And it's, I've taken to kind of just deleting the news apps from my phone, frankly, because I realize how the media makes money. And it's by me tapping on those notifications and not necessarily in service to my own mental health. But what you've really touched on in this whole conversation, and I'm tying it back to what you just shared, was that we have to understand that at the end of the day, these are just people and people have patterns. And when you identify people's patterns, it makes their next action, either makes their current actions, puts them into context, or makes their next action more predictable. And so, as you said, Biden is going to be troubled for the rest of his life by this eternal loss and losing that, the idea of not running for president and being, getting the public's vote, right? But rather than that's an acceptable loss to a politician, is the public's vote. But if he takes himself out of that race, that's another form of loss that he probably hasn't fully vanquished, if you will, because of the loss of the tragedies that he's experienced in his own family. On the other hand, everyone says, oh, Trump's just, wait 72 hours and then listen to what Trump says. But that's his MO. His MO is to come in, stir the pot, and as you said, just kind of skim what he can off the top by kicking up the sediment, and then everything else, but everything ultimately will settle back down because he'll move on to the next pot.
One of the things I want to say here is, people, when I wrote the book, I didn't want to be political because everybody has good and bad characteristics. And if you met these people in person, they're charming, charismatic people. I know people who know these people, and they'll say, even if you don't like them, they're very likable.
Sure.
But what I think that what this time period has taught us or shown us is that the onus is on us, the American public, to make decisions as we evolve into the AI age where people are brands and they're influencers. How do we want our politicians to manage their wealth? We know from the Jerry Ford rule, they'll make money after. And I really think we need a much stronger family office type setup for a president. And look, they could go get the best of the best to run it, and make it where the president isn't involved in their money, but they have third parties running it during that time period, because just putting it in a blind trust doesn't work anymore. It's too hard. People are brands, they're concepts now. People pay, for your point, the clicks. And so it's really something that we as the American public need to be clear about, that we want our politicians to be in a system that we have trust in. Today, nobody has trust in the system. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. No one has trust in the system. And while my cynical response to what you would say is that idea of ceding control is antithetical to that American dream that goes all the way back to our founding fathers, that we were founded as a country because we were shedding the yoke of control of England. And to think that, we have historically as a country shown we don't shoulder that yoke again very willingly. And so that is, that's up to the American voter, and we'll see if they take that on. Any final thoughts or any kind of stories or not even just stories, but really like first principles about just wealth management in general, or that you learned through your study of the presidents that we haven't touched on that you think our listeners would really benefit from?
Yeah, it's funny because I had a lot of my clients read my book. They read it willingly. I didn't force them. And it was interesting. A lot of them called me afterwards and they said, I thought I was successful because I worked hard and I was lucky. And I never thought about all the other things that feeds in, like who you marry, how you assess risk, and so on. But luck was something that I was fascinated with, because when you talk to people who've achieved the American dream, started out with nothing and made their way to the top, they all do talk about luck. And luck, when they actually start to quantify it, is things like consistency. But they also say it has to do with where you're born and what income bracket you're born in. And when you think about it, anyone born in the United States could say they've been incredibly lucky to be born here because there is an opportunity set. But the income bracket you're born in, it used to be you could climb. But if you look at the data from the 1970s on, what you've seen is the middle class shrinking, and either the high earners and the low earners, that's getting larger. And so I think what my book had for me was what I walked away from, and I challenge people to think about it, is I do still believe in the American dream. I think it's still possible, but I think it's harder than ever before. And we've got to think about ways to help people achieve it where we're not villainizing them, right? Villainizing them because they have money, villainizing them because they don't have money. And we've got to really work through our institutions to make sure that we protect our country as time goes on, because we can't just write checks without balancing things, right? You and I have both run long-term cash flows for people to make sure they have enough money to retire on. We got to do the same thing for our country because there's a lot of concerns out there. So we really need to work hard at preserving the American dream in the right way.
And to your point, that used to be going to college was a way to preserve, right? That was your ticket. And I think that AI will be a tool that moves that separation higher on the income bracket, if you will. And I think there will be people, unfortunately, that the middle class shrinking, the majority of those will take a step down, unfortunately, because there just won't be as many opportunities. And they will be leaving with $250,000 worth of debt and a $25 an hour job. And those economics don't last very long. So this exploitative approach to capitalism, as you say, I think is a bit of a challenge. But there I go, editorializing. I won't attribute that to you. That's attributed to me.
No, I love it. I love it. Look, I think it's good to have healthy debate. I think that Americans are best when they try to find common ground.
Yeah.
And I do hope, my hope for the country is we look more for what we have in common than what we have differences, because that's when we work best.
That is the perfect pin to put in our conversation and to hang as our final thought. So, Megan, this is fantastic. Tell us more about where folks, obviously we'll link to the book in the notes, but let's just say I was interested by something you had to share and wanted to learn more. Where can I find that?
Sure. You can find me at allthepresidentsmoney.com. And the book is out in paperback on September 9th, available for pre-order. And, you can find me at allthepresidentsmoney.com or on LinkedIn.
Perfect. Well, we will link to that, and we look forward to the launch in about a month's time. So thank you for including us in your promo tour.
Thank you for having me.